Picture a child sitting in a small wooden chair. The room smells like chalk and old paper. Outside, the wind is moving through the trees. A bird lands on the windowsill, then disappears. But the child does not follow it with their eyes for long, because the teacher is speaking, and you are not supposed to look away. So the child looks forward, sits still, waits. No one explains why. No one needs to. The child already knows, somehow, that this is what you do here. You listen. You follow. You stay in your seat. But here's the question that most of us never stop to ask. When did we learn that? And why? Long before there were classrooms, there were fires. Small fires, built in the open air, surrounded by people who depended on each other completely. These were the earliest human communities. Groups of 20, 30, maybe 50 people moving together across vast and dangerous landscapes. There were no walls around them. No laws written on paper. No police, no courts, no governments. There was only the group. And the group was everything. In that world, survival was not an individual project. You could not hunt alone and expect to eat. You could not sleep safely without others watching. You could not raise a child, cross a river, or survive a harsh winter by yourself. Every person's life was connected to every other person's life in a way that is difficult for us to imagine today. And so, very naturally, rules appeared. Not because someone sat down and decided to invent them, but because communities that had rules, that shared food fairly, that respected boundaries, that listened to those with more experience, simply lasted longer. They survived winters that killed other groups. They raised more children. They passed on their habits to the next generation. This is important to understand. The earliest rules were not about control. They were about continuation. A young member of the group who ignored the wisdom of elders was not just being rebellious. They were putting everyone at risk. Wandering too far from camp, eating unknown plants, challenging the wrong person at the wrong moment. These were not just bad choices. They were potentially fatal ones. So communities developed ways to teach the young. Not in classrooms, of course, but through watching, through imitation, through stories told around the fire, and sometimes through very direct and serious consequences when a rule was broken. Children learned by being part of the group, observing adults, following experienced hunters, listening to the elders speak. Anthropologists who study early human societies have noted something remarkable. In almost every culture ever recorded, children were not taught what to think as a first lesson. They were taught how to be, how to behave within the group, how to read the social world around them, how to know their place in the larger order of things. This is where it begins. Not in a school building, not with a teacher standing at a board, but around fires, in small groups, under open skies, where the first and most important lesson was always the same. We survive together, or we do not survive at all. And embedded inside that lesson, quietly, almost invisibly, was something else. A message that did not need words, that the needs of the group come before the desires of the individual, that fitting in is not weakness, it is wisdom, that obedience, in its earliest form, was not submission. It was intelligence, that feeling. The feeling that following the rules keeps you safe, that belonging requires a certain kind of quietness, is very, very old. It lives in us still, and it followed us, eventually, into the classroom. For thousands of years, learning stayed informal. It lived inside daily life, in the fields, in the market, beside the craftsman's workbench. A child learned by standing next to someone older and watching carefully. Knowledge passed from hands to hands, from voice to ear, from one generation into the next. There was no fixed place for it, no bell to signal when it started or stopped. Then something changed. Around 5,000 years ago, in the river valleys of ancient Mesopotamia, civilization began to grow in a new direction. Cities appeared, trade expanded, governments formed, and with them came something that had never quite existed before: the need to manage large numbers of people, consistently, predictably, at scale. The Sumerians, one of the world's earliest civilizations, established what historians consider the first formal schools. They were called aduba, a word that translates roughly as tablet house. Students, almost exclusively boys from wealthy or administrative families, would sit together and spend long hours copying symbols onto clay tablets, memorizing texts, and repeating exercises until perfect accuracy was achieved. The curriculum was strict. The methods were repetitive, and discipline was enforced firmly. Ancient records describe teachers who punished students physically for arriving late, speaking out of turn, or producing careless work. This was not education designed to awaken curiosity. It was education designed to produce scribes, people who could faithfully record, transmit, and execute the instructions of the state. Notice what had shifted. In early human communities, rules existed to protect the group. Everyone felt the logic of them, but inside the Adaba, the rule became something different. It became a performance. You followed not because you understood why, but because the institution required it. The connection between obedience and survival was still there, but it had grown abstract. Follow the rules, copy the symbols correctly, stay in your place, and you will have a position, a salary, a life within the system. The building itself sent a message. Walls created separation between inside and outside, between student and the wider world. Time was divided and controlled. Behavior was observed and corrected. Learning stopped being something that happened everywhere and became something that happened here, in this place, under these conditions, according to these rules. Think of a young boy in the ancient classroom, pressing a reed stylus into soft clay for the 5th hour in a row. His hand is tired, his back aches. Outside, he can hear sounds from the street, but he does not put down the stylus. He has learned, without anyone explaining it directly, that this room has its own logic, and that logic requires stillness, repetition, and compliance across different civilizations. Egypt, China, Greece, Rome. Variations of this model appeared independently. The specific content changed, the language changed, but the structure remained surprisingly consistent. A fixed space, an authority figure, a body of knowledge to be received, and a student whose role was primarily to absorb and obey. The school was becoming something larger than a place of learning. It was becoming a machine for shaping human beings into a particular kind of person, one who knew, instinctively, how to function inside a system. Every child begins as a question. Before they learn to read, before they learn to sit still, before they learn to raise their hand and wait, they ask. Constantly, sometimes exhaustingly, they ask, why is the sky that color? Why do people die? Why can't I touch that? Why does that man look sad? The questions come without filter, without embarrassment, without any sense that asking might be inconvenient or inappropriate. Curiosity in a young child is not a hobby. It is the primary way they move through the world. And then slowly, something begins to change. It does not happen through a single dramatic moment. There is no one conversation, no single teacher, no specific rule that causes it. It happens through accumulation, through hundreds of small moments repeated across months and years that together teach a quiet and lasting lesson. You raise your hand, but the lesson moves on without your question. You say something unexpected and the class laughs and the teacher looks slightly impatient. You finish the assigned work early and reach for something more interesting, and you are told to wait. You ask why, genuinely, curiously, and the answer you receive is, because that is how we do it here. Each moment, individually, seems small, but the child is paying attention. Children always pay attention, not to what adults say, but to what adults reward. And what gets rewarded, again and again, is not curiosity. It is compliance. It is the correct answer given in the correct format at the correct time. It is sitting quietly. It is not disrupting the flow. A child who follows instructions well is called a good student. A child who asks too many questions, who finishes tasks differently than instructed, who challenges the logic of an exercise, that child is, at best, called difficult. At worst, they are made to feel that something is wrong with the way their mind works. This is the hidden cost. Not loud, not violent, not even intentional in most cases, but real. Think of a girl, perhaps 9 years old, who loves to draw, not to color inside the lines given to her, but to fill the margins of her notebooks with invented creatures and strange landscapes. Her teacher notices and tells her, not unkindly, to pay attention, to focus, to save that for later. And she does, because she is bright enough to understand what the room requires. She learns to save that part of herself for elsewhere, or sometimes for nowhere at all. What gets lost is not always visible. It is not a skill that disappears on a test score. It is something more interior, the quiet confidence that your own thinking is worth following, that a question without an obvious answer is still a question worth asking, that the unexpected direction might be exactly the right one. The tension between curiosity and compliance did not begin in modern schools. It has been present in structured learning for thousands of years. But somewhere along the way we stopped seeing it as a tension at all. We began to call compliance maturity, and we forgot that, once, we were all questions. There is a word we rarely question, normal. We say it easily, A normal school day. A normal classroom. A normal education. The word feels neutral, almost invisible, as if what we call normal simply emerged naturally, like weather, like seasons, as if it could not have been any other way. But the modern school system was not natural. It was designed. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, something unprecedented was happening across Europe and North America. The Industrial Revolution was pulling millions of people out of rural life and into factories, mills, and large urban centers. Society was reorganizing itself at extraordinary speed, and the people managing that reorganization had a problem. Factories required workers who could arrive on time, follow multi-step instructions, perform repetitive tasks without complaint, and accept the authority of supervisors they had never chosen. The rhythms of industrial labor were rigid and unforgiving, and most people, raised in the loose informality of rural and craft-based life, were not prepared for them. The solution, debated openly among politicians and industrialists of the era, was education. Not education in the old philosophical sense, not the cultivation of wisdom or independent thought, but education as preparation, as conditioning, as a way of building in children the habits that industry required. Prussia, in the early 1800s, became the model that much of the world would eventually follow. The Prussian education system introduced mandatory schooling, standardized curriculum, strict age-based progression, and centralized control over what was taught and how. Students learned to move through the day according to fixed schedules. They were grouped by age rather than ability or interest. They were evaluated by uniform examinations. Bells marked the beginning and end of each activity. Obedience to the timetable was not optional. It was the invisible foundation on which everything else was built. Educators from the United States, Japan, and across Europe traveled to Prussia specifically to study and import this model. By the end of the 19th century, versions of it had spread across much of the industrialized world. The design was not hidden. Influential figures of the time wrote directly about the goal: to produce citizens who were literate enough to follow instructions, disciplined enough to show up reliably, and conditioned enough not to resist the structures they were placed inside. And it worked, quietly, effectively, across generations. A man who attended school in 1910 and then entered a factory in 1920 would have found the transition strangely familiar. The bell, the supervisor at the front, the rows, the expectation of silence and steady output. School had not prepared him for the factory. In a very real sense, school had been the factory, a smaller version of it, run on children until the habits became permanent. What makes this remarkable is not that it happened. It is that it stopped being visible. Within 2 or 3 generations, the industrial school model had become simply school, the only version most people could imagine. Parents who had been shaped by it raised children inside it without question, because it was all they had ever known. The design disappeared into the background, the way walls disappear when you have lived inside them long enough. We stopped asking who built the walls. We simply learned to live within them. So here we are, my friends. We have followed this thread from the fires of early human communities, through the clay tablet houses of ancient Mesopotamia, through the slow and deliberate construction of a system built to produce a particular kind of person. And now we arrive at the question that perhaps matters most. Not where this came from, but what we do with the knowledge that it exists. Because understanding the history of something does not automatically free us from it. Knowing that the walls were built does not make them disappear. The habits formed across years of schooling do not dissolve the moment we become aware of them. The instinct to wait for permission, to seek the correct answer rather than an honest one, to measure our thinking against what will be approved, these are deep patterns. They are placed inside us early, and they are comfortable in the way that all old habits are comfortable. They feel, still, like common sense. But awareness does something quiet and important. It creates a small space between the habit and the response, a moment, brief, sometimes easy to miss, where a choice is possible. The question is not whether rules are necessary. They are. The earliest communities understood this, and they were not wrong. A life without any structure is not freedom. It is chaos. Some forms of obedience are simply wisdom. Knowing when to listen, when to defer, when to accept the guidance of someone who knows more than you. These are not failures of the self. They are signs of a mind that is honest about its own limits. But there is a difference between choosing to follow and never thinking to question, between obedience that comes from understanding and obedience that comes from habit alone, between a person who knows the rules and has decided they make sense, and a person who follows the rules simply because no one ever suggested they were allowed to ask why. That second kind of person, the one who never stops to ask, is exactly what the industrial school system hoped to produce, not because those who designed it were villains. Most of them believed genuinely that they were building something good, but the shape of what they built, the deep structure of it, discouraged exactly the kind of thinking that might someday look at the structure itself and say, wait, does this still make sense? You have asked that question tonight, my friends. Perhaps without fully realizing it, simply by listening this far, and that is not a small thing. We are living in a world that changes faster than any school system can follow. The habits that serve the factory may not serve what comes next. The ability to follow instructions will always matter. But so will the ability to notice when the instructions no longer fit the moment, to think from the inside out rather than from the outside in. The deepest education is not the one that teaches you what to think, or even how to think. It is the one that quietly, over time, helps you trust that your thinking is worth beginning. That is the lesson no bell ever announced. Until next time, my friends, sleep well and stay curious.